Behind the golden gates of Ravencrest Palace, where centuries-old traditions clash with modern ambitions, a power struggle is brewing that could reshape an entire kingdom. When Queen Consort Isabella attempts to rewrite the rules that have governed the monarchy for generations, she discovers that even queens must answer to forces greater than themselves. What begins as a simple assertion of authority quickly spirals into a palace crisis that threatens not just relationships, but the very foundation of the crown itself. In a world where every whisper echoes through marble halls and every decision carries the weight of history, one woman's desire for control will ignite a fire that burns through the heart of the royal family, leaving no one unchanged. This is the story of ambition, tradition, and the dangerous game of power played behind closed doors, where the stakes are nothing less than the future of a throne. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floors of Ravencrest Palace as Queen Consort Isabella Wellington Hayes stood before the massive windows of the East Wing drawing room. Her reflection stared back at her, crowned with perfectly styled auburn hair and adorned in a navy blue dress that spoke of both elegance and authority. At 48, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had spent the last 15 years learning the intricate dance of royal protocol, yet today felt different. Today, she was ready to step beyond the boundaries that had been carefully drawn around her role. The palace had been her home since marrying King Frederick III, but it had never truly felt like hers to command. Every decision, from the arrangement of flowers in the state rooms to the guest lists for official dinners, had to be approved through a maze of advisors, private secretaries, and, ultimately, her husband. Isabella had grown tired of being a beautiful ornament in someone else's carefully orchestrated world. She turned as the familiar sound of heeled footsteps echoed through the hallway. Lady Margaret Thornfield, her private secretary and confidant, entered carrying a leather portfolio thick with documents. Margaret was a woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and sharp green eyes that missed nothing. She had served the royal household for over 20 years and understood the delicate balance of palace politics better than most. "Your Majesty, the morning briefings are ready," Margaret said, placing the portfolio on the antique mahogany desk that dominated one corner of the room. "The charity patron requests, the state dinner preparations, and the correspondence from the Commonwealth representatives." Isabella moved away from the window, her silk dress rustling softly as she approached the desk. But instead of opening the familiar folders, she fixed Margaret with a determined look that the older woman had never seen before. "Margaret, I want to make some changes," Isabella announced, her voice carrying a new edge of authority. "Real changes. I'm tired of being a figurehead who smiles and waves while others make every meaningful decision about my own household." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, a subtle sign of surprise in the carefully controlled world of royal service. "What kind of changes did you have in mind, Your Majesty?" Isabella opened the top folder, revealing a guest list for the upcoming state dinner honoring the visiting Prime Minister of Aldoria. The list had been prepared by the King's private office, as was tradition, with input from the Foreign Office and various diplomatic advisors. Isabella's role had been simply to approve the floral arrangements and menu selections. "This dinner, for instance," Isabella said, pointing to the carefully typed names. "I want to revise the guest list. There are people here I've never met, dignitaries I have no relationship with, while individuals who have been crucial to my charitable work and personal initiatives are nowhere to be found." Margaret shifted slightly, her hands clasped behind her back. "Your Majesty, the guest list was prepared according to diplomatic protocol. The King's office worked closely with the Foreign Secretary to ensure all appropriate representatives were included." "The King's office," Isabella repeated, her voice taking on a sharper tone. "Everything is always the King's office. When do I get to make decisions about events that I will be hosting, conversations I will be leading, relationships I will be building?" The question hung in the air between them, charged with 15 years of accumulated frustration. Isabella had been a successful international relations consultant before her marriage, someone who understood diplomacy and negotiation. Yet from the moment she accepted Frederick's proposal, her expertise had been politely acknowledged and then systematically sidelined. "I understand your feelings, Your Majesty," Margaret said carefully. "However, there are traditions and protocols that have guided these decisions for generations. The palace operates on a system that has proven stable and effective." Isabella picked up the guest list and began crossing out names with bold, decisive strokes of her pen. "Stable for whom, Margaret?" Effective for what purpose? I want to invite Dr. Sarah Chun from the Children's Medical Research Foundation, Ambassador Elena Vasquez from the Literacy Program, and Professor James Morrison from the Climate Initiative. These are people doing real work that matters to me and to the causes I support. As she spoke, Isabella continued marking changes to the document, her movements becoming more animated with each edit. Margaret watched with growing concern, recognizing that they were venturing into uncharted territory that could have significant repercussions. Your Majesty, perhaps we should discuss these changes with His Majesty's private secretary before implementing them, Margaret suggested diplomatically. Sir Reginald Blackwood has extensive experience with state dinner protocols, and he could advise us on the best way to incorporate your preferences without disrupting diplomatic relationships. Isabella's hand paused mid-stroke, and she looked up at Margaret with flashing eyes. Sir Reginald Blackwood has been making decisions about my public life for 15 years. I don't need his permission to invite guests to an event that I will be hosting in my own home. The words carried a weight that made Margaret realize this was about much more than a guest list. This was about autonomy, respect, and the fundamental question of where the Queen Consort's authority began and ended. Margaret had witnessed many royal disagreements over the years, but this felt different, more personal, and potentially more explosive. Of course, Your Majesty, Margaret replied evenly. However, I feel obligated to mention that any significant changes to state dinner arrangements typically require coordination with multiple offices. The security detail will need to be briefed on new guests, the diplomatic corps will expect certain protocols to be followed, and the media office will need to prepare appropriate briefings. Isabella set down her pen and moved to the tall windows again, looking out at the meticulously maintained palace gardens. Gardeners moved methodically among the rose bushes, each following a plan that had been laid out by someone else, working within boundaries that had been established long before they arrived. The parallel was not lost on her. Do you know what I did before I married Frederick? Isabella asked, her voice softer but no less determined. You were a consultant in international relations, Your Majesty. You worked with several major corporations and government agencies on cross-cultural negotiations. I was good at it, Margaret. Very good. I helped broker deals worth millions of pounds, facilitated partnerships between countries with complex histories, and built relationships that lasted for years. Isabella turned back to face her secretary. Yet somehow, in my own home, I'm not trusted to invite dinner guests without a committee's approval. Margaret nodded slowly, beginning to understand the deeper source of the Queen Consort's frustration. Your skills and experience are certainly valuable assets to the crown, Your Majesty. Then, why aren't they being used? Isabella demanded, returning to the desk and picking up another folder. This one contained proposals for her upcoming charitable engagements, each carefully vetted and approved by various committees. Look at the schedule. Garden parties with the same social circles, ribbon cuttings for projects I had no hand in developing, ceremonial roles at events where I'm expected to smile and say nothing substantive. She flipped through the pages with increasing agitation. I want to launch a comprehensive education initiative for underprivileged children. I want to host a summit on women's economic empowerment. I want to use my position to create real change, not just maintain pretty traditions. Margaret could see that they were approaching a crossroads that would require careful navigation. The Queen Consort's desires were not unreasonable, but the palace operated within systems that had been refined over centuries. Change was possible, but it required delicate handling and, most importantly, the king's support. These are admirable goals, Your Majesty, Margaret said thoughtfully. Perhaps we could schedule a meeting with His Majesty to discuss how to integrate your vision with existing protocols. Isabella's laugh held no humor. A meeting with Frederick? To discuss my vision? Margaret, when was the last time Frederick and I had a meaningful conversation about anything more substantial than weekend plans or social obligations? The question revealed another layer of complexity that Margaret had observed but never directly acknowledged. The king and Queen Consort maintained a public image of unity and partnership, but those closest to them were aware that their private relationship had become increasingly distant over the past few years. Marriage within the royal family faces unique challenges, Margaret offered diplomatically. Marriage within the royal family faces the same challenges as any marriage, plus the added burden of conducting it under public scrutiny while maintaining the fiction that personal relationships don't affect professional decisions, Isabella corrected sharply. Frederick sees me as an extension of his office, not as a partner with my own ideas and capabilities. Isabella walked to a portrait hanging on the far wall, depicting Queen Victoria in her later years. The painting showed a woman of obvious authority and determination, someone who had clearly never doubted her right to make decisions affecting her realm. She managed to be a queen in her own right while married to a prince consort, Isabella observed, gesturing toward the portrait. She didn't spend her reign asking permission to host dinner parties. Margaret followed Isabella's gaze to the portrait. Queen Victoria inherited the throne, Your Majesty. Her situation was quite different from yours. Was it? Isabella challenged. Or did she simply refuse to accept limitations that others tried to place on her authority? Perhaps the difference isn't in the position, but in the person's willingness to claim their power. The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Without waiting for permission to enter, Sir Reginald Blackwood stepped into the room. He was a tall, thin man in his early 60s, with graying hair and a perpetually serious expression that seemed to suggest the weight of the monarchy rested squarely on his shoulders. Your Majesty, he said with a formal bow. I apologize for the interruption, but there's a matter that requires immediate attention. Isabella turned to face him, and Margaret could feel the tension in the room immediately increase. Sir Reginald represented everything that Isabella was beginning to rebel against, the old guard system that prioritized procedure over innovation and tradition over individual input. What matter, Sir Reginald? Isabella asked, her voice taking on the carefully modulated tone she used for official interactions. I've just received word that you've requested changes to the state dinner guest list, Sir Reginald said, producing a copy of the document Isabella had been editing. I'm afraid there are several issues that need to be addressed before any modifications can be implemented. Isabella's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Issues? The individuals you've added to the list haven't undergone the standard security screening process. Additionally, removing certain diplomatic representatives could send unintended messages about the kingdom's foreign policy priorities. The Foreign Office is quite concerned about the potential implications. Margaret watched the exchange with growing apprehension. She could see Isabella's frustration building, while Sir Reginald remained oblivious to the emotional undercurrents of the situation. Sir Reginald, Isabella said slowly, are you telling me that I cannot invite guests to a dinner that I will be hosting? I'm simply explaining the protocols that govern such decisions, Your Majesty. These procedures exist for very good reasons, and they've served the crown well for many years. The crown, Isabella repeated. And what about the person wearing the crown? Do my preferences, my relationships, my judgment count for nothing in these decisions? Sir Reginald looked genuinely puzzled by the question, as if the concept of the Queen Consort having independent opinions about guest lists was foreign to him. Your preferences are certainly valued, Your Majesty, but they must be balanced against diplomatic considerations and security requirements. Balanced, Isabella said, her voice growing colder. By whom? Who exactly is doing this balancing? Because it seems to me that my preferences are being weighed and found wanting without any input from me about what I consider important. Margaret decided it was time to intervene before the conversation escalated beyond repair. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting where all parties could discuss these concerns in detail. But Isabella was no longer interested in diplomatic solutions. No, Margaret. I think it's time for some clarity about roles and responsibilities here. Sir Reginald, I am making changes to this guest list because I believe they will improve the dinner and better serve the interests that I represent as Queen Consort. These are not suggestions or requests. They are decisions. Sir Reginald's composure faltered slightly. In 15 years of working with the royal family, he had never encountered such direct challenge to established procedures. Your Majesty, I believe this matter should be discussed with His Majesty before any final decisions are made. Of course you do, Isabella replied with bitter satisfaction. Because in your mind, every decision I might make must be approved by Frederick. Tell me, Sir Reginald, when Frederick decides to change his schedule or modify his engagements, does he consult with me? The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable without revealing the true nature of the power dynamics within the royal marriage. The king's role and responsibilities are different from yours, Your Majesty, Sir Reginald said carefully. Yes, they are, Isabella agreed. His role includes making decisions independently, while mine apparently consists of seeking permission for everything from guest lists to charitable initiatives. I'm curious, Sir Reginald, where exactly in the constitutional documents does it specify that the Queen Consort must obtain her husband's approval for her official activities? Margaret realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. In all her years of royal service, She had never seen a member of the family directly challenge the established hierarchy so boldly. Sir Reginald, for his part, seemed genuinely uncertain how to respond to such direct questioning. "Your Majesty, there are traditions and understandings that guide these matters," he said finally. "Traditions," Isabella repeated thoughtfully. "You mean precedents set by previous generations based on the assumption that women in my position lack the judgment or authority to make meaningful decisions about their own responsibilities." The accusation hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Sir Reginald's face flushed slightly, whether from embarrassment or indignation was unclear. "I would never suggest such a thing, Your Majesty," he protested. "Then, what exactly are you suggesting?" Isabella demanded. "Because from where I stand, it appears that you're telling me I don't have the authority to invite guests to my own dinner party. If that's not questioning my judgment, what would you call it?" Before Sir Reginald could formulate a response, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the corridor. Margaret recognized the measured pace and confident stride immediately. King Frederick was approaching, likely summoned by news of the developing situation. Isabella heard the footsteps too, and Margaret watched as something shifted in the Queen Consort's expression. The frustration and anger were joined by something else, a kind of steely resolve that suggested this confrontation had been building for much longer than anyone realized. "Perfect timing," Isabella murmured, turning to face the doorway. "Let's see if the king has any insights about where my authority begins and ends." Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as she realized they were about to witness a confrontation that could reshape the dynamics of the royal household. The question was whether it would result in positive change or an irreparable rift that could damage not just personal relationships, but the institution of the monarchy itself. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and Margaret held her breath, waiting to see how the next few minutes would unfold. King Frederick III entered the drawing room with the measured authority of someone accustomed to having his presence immediately acknowledged. At 52, he carried himself with the bearing of a man who had never doubted his right to command respect, his tall frame filling out his perfectly tailored morning suit with natural elegance. His dark hair, now distinguished with silver at the temples, was immaculately styled, and his blue eyes held the sharp intelligence that had served him well in 15 years of kingship. "Good morning," he said pleasantly, his gaze moving from Isabella to Margaret to Sir Reginald. "I understand there's some discussion about the state dinner arrangements." Margaret noticed immediately that Frederick's tone was carefully neutral, the kind of diplomatic voice he used when he suspected he was walking into a delicate situation but hadn't yet determined the best approach to handle it. Isabella remained standing by the portrait of Queen Victoria, her posture straight and unyielding. "Frederick, how good of you to join us. Sir Reginald was just explaining to me why I'm not qualified to choose dinner guests for my own events." Frederick's eyebrows rose slightly at the edge in his wife's voice. In public, Isabella was always the picture of gracious support, but he recognized the warning signs of a brewing disagreement. What he didn't recognize was how far beyond a simple disagreement this situation had already progressed. "I'm sure that's not what Sir Reginald meant," Frederick said diplomatically, moving further into the room. "Perhaps we could discuss whatever concerns have arisen." Sir Reginald stepped forward eagerly, clearly relieved to have the king present to resolve what he viewed as an unfortunate misunderstanding. "Your Majesty, Her Majesty has requested some modifications to the Aldorian state dinner guest list. While her suggestions are certainly well-intentioned, there are protocols and security considerations that must be addressed." Frederick nodded thoughtfully, his expression remaining carefully neutral. "What kind of modifications?" Isabella answered before Sir Reginald could respond. "I want to invite people who actually matter to the work I do, Frederick. People who represent causes I care about, initiatives I support, relationships I've built over years of public service. Instead of the usual collection of diplomatic functionaries who attend every state dinner regardless of their relevance to the actual purpose of the event." The directness of her response clearly surprised Frederick. He was accustomed to Isabella presenting her views more diplomatically, couched in the language of suggestions rather than declarations. "I see," he said slowly. "And what concerns does this raise, Sir Reginald?" "Several issues, Your Majesty," Sir Reginald replied, producing the marked-up guest list. "The individuals Her Majesty wishes to add haven't undergone security screening. Additionally, she's proposed removing several diplomatic representatives whose presence is expected as a matter of protocol." Frederick accepted the document and reviewed Isabella's changes. Margaret watched his face carefully, noting the slight furrow of concentration that appeared between his brows as he processed the modifications. Dr. Sarah Chun, Ambassador Elena Vasquez, Professor James Morrison, Frederick read aloud. These are all people from your charitable work. People doing important work that I support and understand, Isabella corrected firmly. People whose conversations might actually contribute something meaningful to the evening beyond diplomatic small talk and ceremonial pleasantries. Frederick looked up from the list, and Margaret could see him beginning to recognize that this was about more than guest preferences. Isabella, these people can certainly be considered for future events. But for a state dinner honoring the Aldorian Prime Minister, there are specific diplomatic objectives we need to achieve. We, Isabella repeated, her voice sharp with challenge. Or you? Because I wasn't consulted about these diplomatic objectives. I wasn't asked what I hoped to accomplish at this dinner or how I might use the opportunity to advance causes that matter to me. I was simply handed a list of approved guests and told to smile and make conversation. The room fell silent except for the ticking of an ornate clock on the mantelpiece. Margaret realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, a direct challenge to the established order that had governed royal marriages for generations. Frederick set the guest list on the desk and turned to face his wife fully. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of patience that somehow managed to sound more condescending than supportive. Isabella, I understand you want to feel more involved in these decisions. But state dinners aren't social gatherings. They're diplomatic tools with specific purposes and carefully calculated guest lists designed to achieve particular outcomes. Diplomatic tools, Isabella repeated slowly. And what am I in this equation, Frederick? Another diplomatic tool? A decorative element to make the evening more pleasant for your carefully calculated guests. Margaret saw Frederick's jaw tighten slightly, a sign that Isabella's questions were hitting their mark. Sir Reginald shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he could retreat from what was rapidly becoming a personal confrontation between the royal couple. You're my wife and the Queen Consort, Frederick said firmly. Your role is vital to these events and to the monarchy as a whole. Vital, but apparently not autonomous, Isabella shot back. Tell me, Frederick, when was the last time you asked for my input about the guest list for one of your business dinners? When have you ever sought my advice about the diplomatic objectives you want to achieve? Frederick's expression grew more guarded. These matters require specialized knowledge and experience with international relations. Isabella's laugh was sharp and bitter. Specialized knowledge and experience with international relations? Frederick, I spent 12 years working in international relations before I married you. I negotiated contracts with foreign governments, facilitated partnerships between multinational corporations, and built relationships across cultural and political boundaries. What specialized knowledge am I lacking? The question hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. Margaret had known about Isabella's professional background, but she was beginning to realize how systematically that expertise had been dismissed and underutilized during her years as Queen Consort. Your experience is certainly valuable, Frederick said carefully. But the role of Queen Consort involves different considerations and responsibilities. Different considerations, Isabella repeated, such as being decorative rather than functional, such as representing causes rather than creating policy, such as supporting your initiatives rather than developing my own. Sir Reginald cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps I should return later when you've had time to discuss these matters privately. No, Isabella said sharply, not taking her eyes off Frederick. I think Sir Reginald should hear this conversation. After all, he'll need to understand the new dynamic if he's going to work effectively with both of us going forward. Frederick's composure finally showed signs of strain. Isabella, this isn't the appropriate venue for this discussion, isn't it? Isabella challenged. This is where decisions about my official duties are made without my input. This is where my professional capabilities are dismissed in favor of protocols designed by, and for men who never had to consider what it might be like to be qualified for a job, but denied the authority to do it effectively. Margaret found herself in the unusual position of witnessing royal history being made in real time. She had seen disagreements between royal couples before, but never such a fundamental challenge to the established hierarchy. Frederick moved closer to Isabella, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone that suggested he hoped to defuse the situation through personal appeal rather than institutional authority. Isabella, we can discuss your feelings about this privately. There's no need to air these concerns in front of the staff. But Isabella stepped back, maintaining the distance between them and rejecting his attempt to reframe the conversation as a private marital issue. My feelings, she said with dangerous quiet. Frederick, this isn't about feelings. This is about competence, authority, and respect. I'm not having an emotional breakdown. I'm pointing out systemic problems with how decisions are made and implemented in this household. She gestured toward the guest list still lying on the desk. I made reasonable, well-informed changes to that list based on my knowledge of the people involved and my understanding of what might make the evening more productive and meaningful. Instead of discussing the merits of my suggestions, Sir Reginald immediately assumed they were inappropriate and ran to you for authorization to override them. Frederick glanced at Sir Reginald, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Security protocols require advanced screening, Frederick said, attempting to return to practical concerns. And diplomatic considerations do need to be weighed carefully. Fine, Isabella said crisply. Then, let's weigh them. Dr. Chun runs one of the most respected medical research foundations in Europe and has worked with government health agencies across 3 continents. Ambassador Vasquez has been implementing literacy programs in developing nations for over a decade and has formal diplomatic status. Professor Morrison is an internationally recognized climate researcher who advises multiple governments on environmental policy. She moved to the desk and picked up the guest list again, pointing to specific names. Compare that to Lord Pemberton, who inherited his title and whose primary qualification is owning large estates, or Sir Anthony Wickham, whose main contribution to society appears to be serving on various ceremonial committees. Margaret watched Frederick process this comparison and could see him struggling to formulate a response that didn't acknowledge the validity of Isabella's point. Those men represent important constituencies, Frederick said finally. Important to whom? Isabella demanded. To your political allies? To traditional power structures? Or to the people who will actually benefit from the policies and programs that should result from international cooperation? She set the list down and faced Frederick directly, her posture radiating determination. Frederick, I'm not asking to completely overturn established protocols. I'm asking to participate meaningfully in decisions that affect my official duties. I want to use my experience and judgment to make these events more effective and more aligned with the values and priorities that I represent as Queen Consort. Frederick was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret could see him weighing multiple considerations. Finally, he spoke in a measured tone that suggested he was trying to find middle ground. Isabella, I appreciate your perspective, and I recognize that we should probably involve you more in these planning processes. But for this particular dinner, we're less than 2 weeks away from the event. Major changes at this point could create complications. Complications, Isabella repeated flatly. Frederick, do you hear yourself? You're treating my professional judgment as a complication to be managed rather than an asset to be utilized. Sir Reginald, sensing an opening to support his king, stepped forward slightly. Your Majesty, if I may suggest, perhaps we could schedule a comprehensive review of event planning procedures after the Eldorian dinner. That would allow time to develop new protocols that incorporate Her Majesty's input while maintaining necessary security and diplomatic standards. Isabella turned to look at Sir Reginald with an expression that made Margaret grateful she wasn't the target of that particular stare. Sir Reginald, thank you for that suggestion. It perfectly illustrates the problem I'm describing. You're proposing to create a committee to study how to include me in decisions about my own official duties. Do you see how that might strike me as patronizing? Sir Reginald's face flushed again. I meant no disrespect, Your Majesty. I'm sure you didn't, Isabella replied evenly. That's what makes this so problematic. You can dismiss my authority and undermine my professional judgment while believing you're being respectful and following proper procedures. Frederick stepped forward, clearly recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond his ability to manage through diplomatic language. Isabella, you're being unfair to Sir Reginald. He's following established procedures that have served the monarchy well for many years. Isabella's composure finally cracked slightly, and Margaret could see the depth of frustration that had been building for years. Served the monarchy well for many years, Isabella repeated with bitter emphasis. Frederick, those procedures were established when Queen's consort were expected to be decorative wives with no education, no professional experience, and no opinions beyond selecting china patterns and planning garden parties. She gestured toward the portrait of Queen Victoria again. Even she had to fight for the right to participate in governing her own country. Are you telling me that in the 21st century, I should have less authority over my official duties than she had over hers in the 19th? The comparison to Queen Victoria was brilliant and cutting, Margaret realized. Frederick couldn't argue against Queen Victoria's legacy without appearing to diminish the monarchy itself, but he also couldn't support Isabella's position without acknowledging that current procedures were indeed outdated and potentially discriminatory. The situations are hardly comparable, Frederick said finally, but his response lacked conviction. Aren't they? Isabella pressed. Both involve women who brought professional experience and political acumen to their royal roles. Both involve questions about whether marriage to a king should eliminate a woman's right to exercise independent judgment about her official responsibilities. Frederick was quiet for several moments, and Margaret could see him struggling to find a response that would satisfy Isabella without completely undermining the established order that had shaped his entire reign. Isabella, he said finally, his voice carrying a note of authority that suggested he was preparing to end the discussion through royal decree rather than reasoned argument. I understand your concerns, and I promise we'll discuss them more thoroughly after the Eldorian visit. But, for now, I need you to work within established procedures. The words fell into the room like stones, and Margaret realized that Frederick had just made a critical error in judgment. Instead of addressing Isabella's substantive points or acknowledging the validity of her concerns, he had fallen back on the assertion of hierarchical authority. Isabella stood very still for a moment, and, when she spoke, her voice was dangerously calm. You need me to work within established procedures, she repeated slowly. Frederick, let me be very clear about what you're saying. You're telling me that despite my education, experience, and 15 years of faithful service to this crown, you don't trust my judgment enough to allow me to make decisions about my own official duties. That's not what I said, Frederick protested, but Margaret could see that he realized he had walked into a trap. Then, what are you saying? Isabella demanded. Because from where I stand, it sounds like you're ordering me to accept that my role is to follow instructions rather than exercise independent judgment. Is that an accurate characterization of your position? Frederick looked around the room as if searching for support, but Sir Reginald was staring at his shoes, and Margaret was maintaining strict neutrality. Isabella, you're twisting my words. I'm clarifying them, Isabella corrected sharply. You've just told me that you need me to work within established procedures. Those procedures give me no meaningful authority over my official duties. Therefore, you need me to accept that I have no meaningful authority over my official duties. Is that statement accurate or not? The logical trap was perfectly constructed, and Margaret watched Frederick realize that any answer he gave would either support Isabella's position or reveal the fundamental inequity of the current system. This is not the time or place for this discussion, Frederick said finally, attempting to assert control through procedural objection. On the contrary, Isabella replied with cold precision. This is exactly the time and place. This is where decisions about my official duties are made, and this is when those decisions are being implemented. If I'm not allowed to participate meaningfully in this process now, when exactly will I be allowed to do so? Frederick's composure was beginning to show significant strain. He was clearly unaccustomed to having his authority challenged so directly and systematically, especially by someone who should theoretically be his strongest ally. Isabella, I won't continue this discussion while you're in this frame of mind. My frame of mind. Isabella's voice rose slightly for the first time since the conversation began. Frederick, what exactly is wrong with my frame of mind? I'm being logical, systematic, and professional. I'm addressing substantive issues with specific examples and reasonable solutions. What about that strikes you as problematic? Margaret realized they had reached a crucial moment. Frederick could either acknowledge that Isabella's concerns were legitimate and deserved serious consideration, or he could continue to treat them as emotional outbursts to be managed rather than professional disagreements to be resolved. Isabella, we'll discuss this privately, Frederick said firmly, his voice carrying clear dismissal. But Isabella wasn't finished. No, Frederick, we'll discuss this now, with the people who will be implementing whatever decisions we make. Because apparently, the only way to ensure that my professional judgment is taken seriously is to make it impossible for anyone to pretend this conversation never happened. The gauntlet had been thrown down, and Margaret realized that the next few minutes would determine not just the outcome of this particular disagreement, but the fundamental nature of the relationship between the king and queen consort going forward. The silence that followed Isabella's declaration stretched taut as a wire, and Margaret could feel the weight of history pressing down on the elegant drawing room. Frederick's face had gone carefully blank, the expression he wore during the most challenging diplomatic negotiations when he needed time to calculate his next move without revealing his thoughts. Isabella, he said finally, his voice carrying a warning that everyone in the room recognized. You're making this personal when it should remain professional. Isabella's smile was sharp as crystal. Frederick, everything about this is personal. The fact that you can't see that is part of the problem. She moved away from the desk and began pacing slowly, her movements controlled, but carrying an energy that made the room feel electric. Margaret had never seen the queen consort like this, fully unleashed and unafraid of consequences. Do you know what I did yesterday? Isabella asked, not waiting for an answer. I spent 3 hours in meetings about my upcoming charitable engagements. 3 hours sitting in a room while other people made decisions about how I would spend my time, what causes I would support, what messages I would deliver, and what outcomes I would be expected to achieve. She paused by the window, looking out at the gardens where the perfectly ordered landscape reflected the rigid structure of palace life. Not once in those 3 hours was I asked what I thought would be most effective. Not once was I consulted about which initiatives might benefit from royal patronage. I sat there like a beautiful ornament while men who have never worked in charitable organizations discussed the best way to utilize my time and influence. Frederick's jaw tightened. Those meetings include experienced advisors who understand the complexities of royal charitable work. Experienced advisors, Isabella repeated, turning back to face him. Tell me, Frederick, how many of those experienced advisors have actually run charitable organizations? How many have written grants, managed budgets, or developed programs that serve vulnerable populations? When Frederick didn't answer immediately, Isabella continued with building momentum. Because I have. Before I married you, I spent 2 years volunteering with refugee resettlement organizations while building my consulting practice. I know what it's like to try to make real change with limited resources and bureaucratic obstacles. But, apparently, that experience is less valuable than the opinions of men who have spent their careers managing other people's charitable work from comfortable offices. Sir Reginald shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing he could escape the increasingly personal nature of the conversation. But Isabella's attention fixed on him with laser precision. Sir Reginald, you've been managing royal charitable engagements for over a decade. Tell me, what direct experience do you have with charitable work outside of coordinating royal appearances? Sir Reginald's face flushed deeply. Your Majesty, my role has been to ensure that royal engagements align with constitutional requirements and maintain appropriate dignity. Constitutional requirements and appropriate dignity, Isabella said thoughtfully. In other words, you make sure I look good and don't say anything controversial, but you don't actually care whether my presence accomplishes anything meaningful. That's not fair, Sir Reginald protested. Royal patronage provides significant benefits to charitable organizations. Benefits like what? Isabella pressed. Media attention? Prestige? Or actual improvements in the lives of people these organizations serve? Margaret watched the exchange with growing fascination. Isabella was systematically dismantling the justifications for the current system while forcing everyone in the room to confront their assumptions about the value of traditional royal work. Royal patronage brings visibility and credibility to important causes, Frederick interjected, clearly trying to regain control of the conversation. Visibility and credibility, Isabella agreed, both of which could be dramatically increased if the royal patron actually understood the work being done and could speak substantively about the issues involved. She returned to the desk and picked up one of the folders Margaret had brought earlier, flipping through it quickly before selecting a specific document. Here's a perfect example, she said, holding up an invitation to visit a children's hospital. I'm scheduled to tour the facility, meet with some patients, and deliver remarks about the importance of pediatric healthcare. The visit is planned for 45 minutes, including travel time between wings. Isabella looked up from the document, her expression incredulous. 45 minutes to understand and meaningfully engage with one of the country's leading medical institutions. Do you know how insulting that is to the doctors, nurses, and researchers who dedicate their lives to saving children? Frederick's expression grew more guarded. Isabella, there are scheduling constraints that require efficient use of time. Scheduling constraints, Isabella repeated. Frederick, I have an undergraduate degree in public policy and a master's degree in international development. I spent 5 years working with organizations that provide medical services in underserved communities. I could have meaningful conversations with those healthcare professionals about medical access, funding challenges, research priorities, and policy implications. But, instead, I'm scheduled for a photo opportunity that makes everyone feel good without accomplishing anything substantial. Margaret realized they were witnessing something unprecedented in her years of royal service. Isabella wasn't just complaining about her treatment. She was methodically documenting the systematic waste of her professional capabilities. Your Majesty, Sir Reginald said carefully, these events serve important symbolic functions that shouldn't be underestimated. Isabella's look could have frozen champagne. Sir Reginald, I spent 12 years before my marriage helping organizations navigate complex challenges and achieve concrete results. I know the difference between symbolic gestures and meaningful action. The question is whether anyone in this palace is interested in meaningful action or just maintaining comfortable traditions. She set the document back on the desk and faced Frederick directly, her posture radiating controlled determination. Frederick, I want to restructure my official duties to make better use of my education and experience. I want to spend less time on ceremonial appearances and more time developing substantial initiatives that can create real change. I want to use my position to convene experts, facilitate partnerships, and drive policy discussions that can improve people's lives. Frederick was quiet for several long moments, and Margaret could see him struggling to process the fundamental challenge Isabella was presenting to the established order. Isabella, the ceremonial aspects of royal duty serve important constitutional functions, he said finally. They maintain public connection to the monarchy and demonstrate our commitment to various causes. I'm not suggesting we eliminate ceremony, Isabella clarified. I'm suggesting we balance ceremony with substance. I'm proposing that we use royal influence to create actual improvements rather than just providing pretty pictures for the media. She moved to stand directly in front of Frederick, forcing him to look her in the eye as she continued. Let me be specific about what I want to do. I want to host an annual summit on women's economic empowerment, bringing together female entrepreneurs, policymakers, and researchers to develop concrete strategies for improving women's economic opportunities. I want to launch a scholarship program for students from underserved communities who want to pursue careers in public service. I want to create a network of partnerships between British institutions and international development organizations. Each proposal was delivered with precision and conviction, and Margaret could see that Isabella had been thinking about these ideas for much longer than today's conversation might suggest. These are admirable goals, Frederick said carefully, but they would require significant resources and coordination with multiple government agencies. Isabella's smile was triumphant. Frederick, that's exactly my point. These initiatives would require exactly the kind of international relations experience and policy development skills that I bring to this role. They would make use of my professional background while serving important public purposes. She gestured toward the folders on the desk. Compare that to my current schedule of garden parties, ribbon cuttings, and ceremonial appearances that any well-dressed person with basic social skills could handle equally well. Frederick looked around the room again, his expression suggesting he was beginning to realize the depth of the challenge Isabella was presenting. This wasn't a temporary emotional outburst that could be managed with patience and diplomacy. This was a fundamental rethinking of the role of queen consort that had implications far beyond their personal relationship. Isabella, these kinds of initiatives would need to be developed carefully and coordinated with existing government programs, he said. But his tone lacked the authority it had carried earlier in the conversation. Of course they would, Isabella agreed readily. That's why I want to begin planning them now. I want to spend the next 6 months developing detailed proposals, consulting with relevant experts, and building the partnerships necessary to make them effective. Margaret watched Frederick realize that Isabella had moved beyond complaining about the current system to presenting specific alternatives. This wasn't just criticism. It was a comprehensive reform agenda presented by someone with the knowledge and experience to implement it successfully. These proposals would represent a significant departure from traditional royal charitable work, Sir Reginald observed nervously. Yes, they would, Isabella agreed with satisfaction. They would represent an evolution from 19th century models of royal charity to 21st century approaches to social impact. She moved back to the window, looking out at the gardens again before turning to face the room with renewed determination. Gentlemen, let me be very clear about where we stand. I am no longer willing to accept a role that systematically underutilizes my capabilities and wastes opportunities to create meaningful change. I will either be allowed to develop and implement substantial initiatives that make use of my professional background, or I will find other ways to contribute to society. The implied threat hung in the air like smoke. Margaret felt her stomach clench as she realized Isabella was prepared to take this confrontation to its logical conclusion, whatever the consequences might be. Frederick's face went very still. Isabella, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying that I refuse to spend the rest of my life as a decorative accessory to your reign. Isabella replied with crystalline clarity. I'm saying that I will either be treated as a professional partner with meaningful responsibilities, or I will reconsider whether this role serves any purpose that justifies the personal sacrifices it requires. The room fell completely silent except for the distant sound of gardeners working outside. Margaret realized she was witnessing a moment that could reshape the monarchy itself, depending on how Frederick chose to respond to his wife's ultimatum. Frederick studied Isabella's face for a long moment, and Margaret could see him calculating the implications of various responses. Finally, he spoke in a voice that carried both wariness and a new note of respect. Isabella, these are serious matters that deserve serious consideration. But making threats about your commitment to the monarchy isn't the way to address them constructively. I'm not making threats, Isabella corrected calmly. I'm stating facts. I am a highly educated, professionally experienced woman who has spent 15 years supporting this institution while watching my capabilities go unused and my judgment go unvalued. That situation is no longer acceptable to me. She moved closer to Frederick, her voice taking on an intensity that made everyone in the room lean forward slightly. Frederick, I love this country, and I believe in the potential of the monarchy to serve positive purposes in modern society. But I will not continue to participate in a system that treats me like an attractive mannequin whose primary value is looking appropriate at public events. Margaret felt like she was watching a chess match between grandmasters, with each move calculated for maximum strategic impact. Isabella had systematically dismantled every justification for the status quo while presenting clear alternatives and making her position unambiguous. Frederick was quiet for nearly a minute, his expression cycling through various emotions before settling on something that looked like grudging recognition. Isabella, your proposals merit serious discussion, he said finally. But implementing changes of this magnitude would require careful planning and coordination with multiple offices. I agree completely, Isabella said with sudden warmth, as if Frederick had just offered exactly what she'd been hoping to hear. I propose we establish a working group to develop detailed plans for restructuring my official duties. I want representatives from my office, your office, the Foreign Ministry, and relevant charitable organizations. Margaret realized that Isabella had been playing a much longer game than anyone had recognized. The guest list controversy had been the opening move in a comprehensive campaign to reshape her role within the monarchy. A working group could certainly explore possibilities, Frederick said cautiously, clearly recognizing that he had been outmaneuvered but not yet sure how to regain control of the situation. Excellent, Isabella said with brilliant smile. I'll prepare detailed proposals for our first meeting. I think we should plan to begin immediately after the Aldorian state dinner. She moved back to the desk and picked up the modified guest list again, her manner suddenly businesslike and efficient. Now, about this dinner. I believe my proposed changes would actually enhance the diplomatic value of the evening by demonstrating our commitment to substantive international cooperation rather than just ceremonial protocol. Frederick looked at the list again, and Margaret could see him reassessing Isabella's modifications in light of the broader conversation they had just had. Dr. Chin's work in medical research, Ambassador Vasquez's literacy programs, and Professor Morrison's climate research all represent areas where international collaboration could yield significant benefits. Isabella continued smoothly. Including them would signal that we're serious about using diplomatic opportunities to address real challenges rather than just maintaining traditional relationships. Margaret watched Frederick struggle with the realization that Isabella's guest list changes were not only reasonable, but potentially more effective than the original selections. The woman he had been treating as an emotional wife making impractical demands had just revealed herself to be a strategic thinker with a comprehensive vision for reform. Security screening for new guests would take time, Sir Reginald said weakly, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Then, we should begin immediately, Isabella replied briskly. I'll provide complete background information for all 3 individuals this afternoon. They're all established professionals with existing government clearances, so the process should be straightforward. Frederick set the guest list down and looked at his wife with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. It might have been frustration, admiration, wariness, or some combination of all 3. Isabella, You've clearly given these matters considerable thought, he said slowly. 15 years of considerable thought, Isabella confirmed. I've spent 15 years watching opportunities to create meaningful change pass by while we maintained comfortable traditions. I'm no longer willing to watch. The conversation had reached a natural conclusion, but Margaret sensed that the real implications were just beginning to unfold. Isabella had fundamentally altered the power dynamics of the royal household in the span of one morning, and the reverberations of that change would affect everyone who worked within the palace walls. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation settled over Ravencrest Palace like morning mist, visible but difficult to grasp. In the 48 hours following Isabella's ultimatum, Margaret found herself navigating uncharted territory as the established rhythms of royal life began to shift in subtle but unmistakable ways. The first sign of change came in the form of an emergency meeting called by the palace secretary, Lord Pemberton, a man whose family had served the crown for 3 generations and whose understanding of royal protocol was both encyclopedic and inflexible. Margaret found herself summoned to his oak-paneled office along with Sir Reginald and several other senior staff members, all of whom wore expressions of barely concealed anxiety. Ladies and gentlemen, Lord Pemberton began without preamble, his weathered face grave beneath silver hair that hadn't moved in decades. We find ourselves facing an unprecedented situation that requires careful handling and absolute discretion. Margaret noticed that he didn't specify what situation he was referring to, as if merely naming Isabella's rebellion might give it additional power. Sir Reginald shifted uncomfortably in his chair, still visibly shaken from his encounter with the Queen Consort's systematic dismantling of his authority. Her Majesty has requested significant modifications to established protocols, Lord Pemberton continued diplomatically. While we must certainly respect her perspectives, we also have obligations to maintain the stability and dignity of the institution. Lady Catherine Worthington, the Palace Communications Director, leaned forward with the sharp-eyed intensity that had made her legendary in royal circles. Have there been any leaks to the press about internal discussions? Because if this becomes public before we can manage the narrative, the implications could be severe. No leaks as yet, Sir Reginald replied, though his tone suggested he considered it only a matter of time. However, Her Majesty has made it clear that she intends to pursue these matters regardless of our concerns about protocol or precedent. Margaret found herself in the uncomfortable position of being the only person in the room who had witnessed the full scope of Isabella's arguments and couldn't entirely disagree with them. The Queen Consort's points about underutilized capabilities and outdated assumptions had been logical and well-articulated, even if her methods had been unconventional. What specific changes is she proposing? Lady Catherine asked, her fingers poised over a leather notebook as if preparing to calculate the public relations implications of each potential modification. Lord Pemberton consulted a document that Margaret recognized as a summary of Isabella's reform proposals. She wants to restructure her charitable duties to focus on what she calls substantial initiatives rather than ceremonial appearances. She's requesting the authority to convene policy discussions, develop partnerships with international organizations, and launch new programs without prior approval from multiple committees. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of Isabella's agenda. Margaret could see each person calculating how these changes would affect their own roles and responsibilities within the carefully ordered hierarchy of palace life. That level of autonomy would represent a fundamental departure from established practices, Sir Reginald observed, his voice tight with concern. Queen consorts have traditionally operated within clearly defined boundaries that ensure their activities complement rather than compete with the king's official duties. Compete. Margaret found herself speaking before she could consider the wisdom of entering the conversation. Sir Reginald, how would educational initiatives and women's empowerment programs compete with His Majesty's official duties? The room's attention turned to her with varying degrees of surprise. Margaret realized she had just aligned herself publicly with Isabella's position, a move that could have significant consequences for her own career, but felt necessary in the face of what seemed like willful misunderstanding of the Queen Consort's proposals. Lady Margaret, Lord Pemberton said carefully, you've worked closely with Her Majesty on these matters. What is your assessment of her current state of mind? The question was loaded with implications about Isabella's mental stability and rational judgment. Margaret chose her words carefully, aware that her response would influence how the palace hierarchy interpreted and responded to the Queen Consort's demands. Her Majesty is frustrated by the systematic underutilization of her professional capabilities, Margaret said diplomatically. She has extensive experience in international relations and policy development that could significantly enhance the effectiveness of royal charitable work. Her proposals are well-researched and strategically sound. Lady Catherine looked up from her notes with sharp interest. Are you suggesting we should support her requests for increased autonomy? Margaret felt the weight of the moment, recognizing that her next words could either support meaningful reform or contribute to the palace's resistance to change. I'm suggesting that Her Majesty's proposals deserve serious consideration based on their merits rather than being dismissed simply because they represent departures from traditional practices, she said carefully. The monarchy has always evolved to meet changing social expectations and needs. Lord Pemberton's expression grew more severe. Evolution, yes. Revolution, no. What Her Majesty is proposing would fundamentally alter the constitutional relationship between the king and queen consort. Would it? Margaret challenged gently. Or would it simply allow the queen consort to utilize her capabilities more effectively in service of the crown's charitable and diplomatic objectives? Before anyone could respond, a knock at the door interrupted the discussion. Lord Pemberton's secretary entered with visible nervousness, carrying a message that she delivered in a voice barely above a whisper. My lord, His Majesty requests your immediate attendance in the blue drawing room. He's meeting with the Prime Minister about urgent matters requiring palace coordination. The implication was clear to everyone in the room. Frederick was consulting with political leadership about how to handle the crisis Isabella's demands had created. Lord Pemberton dismissed the meeting immediately, but not before issuing stern warnings about maintaining absolute confidentiality regarding all palace discussions. Margaret returned to her office with a growing sense that events were accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control them. She found Isabella waiting for her, standing by the window with an expression of calm determination that seemed almost preternatural given the chaos swirling around the palace. Margaret, I need you to help me prepare for a conversation with Frederick this afternoon, Isabella said without preamble. He's meeting with political advisors about my proposals, and I want to be ready with specific implementation strategies that address their likely concerns. Margaret set down her briefcase and studied the queen consort carefully. Your Majesty, are you aware that the senior staff is in crisis mode about your requests for changes? Isabella's smile held no warmth. I'm aware that people who have spent their careers managing a decorative queen consort are panicking about the prospect of working with a functional one. Their concerns are noted, but not particularly relevant to the decisions that need to be made. The dismissive tone was unlike anything Margaret had heard from Isabella before, and she realized that the queen consort had crossed a psychological threshold that made retreat impossible. Your Majesty, if you push too hard too quickly, you risk creating opposition that could make any reform more difficult, Margaret said carefully. Perhaps a more gradual approach might be more effective. Isabella turned from the window to face Margaret directly, her expression sharp with impatience. Margaret, I've been gradual for 15 years. I've been diplomatic, patient, and accommodating while watching my professional capabilities atrophy and my potential contributions go unused. Gradual hasn't worked. She moved to the desk and began pulling out documents that Margaret hadn't seen before, detailed proposals that suggested Isabella had been planning this campaign for months or possibly years. The time for gradual approaches has passed. Isabella continued with crisp efficiency. Frederick and his advisors need to understand that I'm not making requests anymore. I'm stating requirements for my continued participation in this institution. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine as she fully grasped the implications of Isabella's position. The queen consort wasn't just demanding reform. She was threatening to withdraw her cooperation entirely if her demands weren't met. Your Majesty, what exactly do you mean by continued participation? Isabella looked up from her documents with eyes that held no uncertainty. I mean that if this institution cannot find a way to utilize my capabilities effectively and treat me as a professional partner rather than a decorative accessory, I will need to reconsider whether my talents might be better used elsewhere. The statement hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Margaret realized that Isabella was prepared to leave the royal family entirely rather than continue in a role that she found professionally and personally demeaning. Your Majesty, the constitutional implications of such a decision would be enormous, Margaret said carefully. The monarchy has never faced a situation where a queen consort voluntarily withdrew from her duties. Then, perhaps it's time for the monarchy to face new situations, Isabella replied with calm conviction. Institutions that cannot adapt to changing circumstances eventually become irrelevant. I refuse to participate in that irrelevance. Before Margaret could respond, the door opened without a preliminary knock. Frederick entered with visible tension radiating from every line of his body, followed by Lord Pemberton and two men Margaret didn't recognize, but whose bearing suggested high-level government officials. Isabella, Frederick said without preamble, we need to discuss the implications of your recent statements to palace staff. Isabella straightened to her full height, her posture radiating controlled authority. Frederick, gentlemen, how thoughtful of you to visit. I was just reviewing my proposals for restructuring royal charitable initiatives. One of the unknown men stepped forward slightly, his expression grave. Your Majesty, I'm Sir David Ashworth from the Cabinet Office. The Prime Minister has asked me to discuss some concerns about potential constitutional complications arising from recent palace discussions. Isabella's smile was brilliant and dangerous. Sir David, how fascinating that the Prime Minister is concerned about constitutional complications arising from my desire to make royal charitable work more effective. I wasn't aware that proposing educational initiatives and women's empowerment programs raised constitutional issues. Margaret watched the exchange with growing fascination and horror. Isabella was refusing to be intimidated by the presence of government officials and was instead forcing them to articulate exactly why they opposed her proposals. Your Majesty, Sir David said carefully, the concern is not about the specific initiatives you've proposed, but rather about the precedent that might be set by making substantial changes to established royal protocols without proper consultation. Proper consultation, Isabella repeated thoughtfully. Tell me, Sir David, who exactly should I have consulted about my desire to use my education and professional experience more effectively? Should I have asked permission from someone to want to contribute meaningfully to society? Frederick stepped forward, clearly recognizing that the conversation was heading in a dangerous direction. Isabella, Sir David is simply trying to ensure that any changes we implement are constitutionally sound and politically sustainable. Isabella turned her full attention to Frederick, and Margaret could see the accumulated frustration of 15 years burning in her eyes. Frederick, I've spent 15 years being constitutionally sound and politically sustainable while watching my capabilities go to waste. I've been the perfect royal wife, supporting your initiatives, attending your events, and maintaining appropriate dignity while contributing nothing of substance to the causes I care about. She gestured toward the documents on her desk. These proposals represent my attempt to change that situation in ways that would benefit the monarchy, the government, and the people we're supposed to serve. If constitutional soundness and political sustainability require me to continue being decorative rather than functional, then perhaps we need to reconsider what those concepts actually mean. Sir David exchanged a glance with his colleague before speaking again. Your Majesty, no one questions your capabilities or your commitment to public service. However, the role of Queen Consort operates within specific parameters that have evolved over centuries to serve important constitutional functions. Isabella's laugh was sharp and cutting. Constitutional functions, such as ensuring that women married to kings remain subordinate to male authority regardless of their qualifications, such as maintaining the fiction that royal women exist primarily to support their husbands' work rather than pursuing their own initiatives. The accusation of systemic sexism hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Margaret realized that Isabella was forcing everyone in the room to confront the fundamental assumptions underlying royal gender roles. That's not what I said, Sir David protested, but his discomfort was obvious. Then, what are you saying? Isabella demanded. Because from where I stand, it appears that you're arguing for maintaining a system that systematically underutilizes qualified women based on outdated assumptions about appropriate roles and responsibilities. Frederick's face had gone carefully blank, the expression he wore during the most challenging diplomatic crises. Margaret could see him calculating the political implications of the conversation while trying to find a way to defuse the situation without completely capitulating to Isabella's demands. Isabella, perhaps we could discuss these matters privately, he suggested, glancing meaningfully at the government officials. But Isabella was no longer interested in private discussions that could be dismissed or minimized. No, Frederick. These gentlemen came here to discuss constitutional implications, so let's discuss them. I want to understand exactly which aspects of the Constitution require queen consorts to accept professional marginalization as the price of royal marriage. The challenge was direct and unmistakable. Isabella was demanding that Frederick and His advisors articulate the constitutional basis for limiting her authority, knowing that any honest answer would reveal the arbitrary and potentially discriminatory nature of current practices. Lord Pemberton cleared his throat nervously. Your Majesty, these are complex matters that require careful study and consultation with constitutional experts. Isabella's expression grew even more determined. Lord Pemberton, I've had 15 years to study these matters. I've consulted with constitutional experts, historians, and legal scholars. What I've learned is that most limitations on queen consort authority are based on tradition and precedent rather than constitutional requirement. She moved to stand directly in front of Frederick, forcing him to meet her eyes as she delivered her ultimatum. Frederick, I'm prepared to work within constitutional requirements, but I will not continue to accept arbitrary limitations based on outdated assumptions about women's capabilities. Either we find a way to restructure my role to make meaningful use of my professional background, or we need to discuss alternative arrangements for my future. The room fell completely silent except for the distant sound of London traffic filtering through the heavy windows. Margaret realized they were witnessing a moment that would either transform the monarchy or destroy the royal marriage, depending on Frederick's response to his wife's final challenge. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, with Frederick staring at Isabella, as if seeing her clearly for the first time in their 15-year marriage. Margaret watched the king's face cycle through a complex series of emotions, confusion giving way to recognition, then to something that looked remarkably like respect. Sir David Ashworth shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that he had stumbled into a marital confrontation with constitutional implications far beyond anything he had been prepared to handle. Lord Pemberton stood frozen by the door, his face pale with the realization that the careful order he had spent decades maintaining was crumbling around him. Frederick finally broke the silence, his voice quiet but carrying new weight. Isabella, you're asking me to choose between maintaining traditions that have defined the monarchy for generations and supporting changes that could reshape the entire institution. No, Isabella replied with crystalline clarity. I'm asking you to choose between maintaining arbitrary limitations on my authority and allowing me to serve this institution to the best of my abilities. The traditions you're worried about preserving are traditions of exclusion and marginalization, not constitutional requirements. She gestured toward the government officials with a dismissive wave that managed to be both elegant and cutting. These gentlemen came here to discuss constitutional complications, but what they really mean is political inconvenience. It's easier to maintain a decorative queen consort than to deal with one who might have opinions and initiatives that require actual support. Sir David cleared his throat nervously. Your Majesty, if I may suggest, perhaps we could arrange for a comprehensive constitutional review to explore possibilities for evolving royal roles while maintaining institutional stability. Isabella's smile was sharp with triumph. Sir David, that's exactly what I proposed to begin with. The difference is that I'm not asking for permission to want equality of opportunity within my marriage and my role. I'm stating that such equality is a requirement for my continued participation. Margaret realized that Isabella had successfully maneuvered the conversation from whether she should be allowed to pursue reform to how quickly that reform could be implemented. The queen consort had refused to accept the premise that her demands were unreasonable and had instead forced everyone else to justify why they might oppose them. Frederick studied his wife's face intently, and Margaret could see him beginning to grasp the full implications of the choice Isabella was offering him. This wasn't just about guest lists or charitable schedules. This was about the fundamental nature of their partnership and the future direction of the monarchy itself. Isabella, Frederick said slowly, if I agree to support comprehensive reforms to your role, what exactly are you proposing to do with the additional authority and autonomy? The question represented a crucial shift in Frederick's approach. Instead of defending the status quo, he was asking for details about Isabella's alternative vision. Margaret felt a flutter of hope that the confrontation might result in meaningful change rather than destructive conflict. Isabella moved to the desk and picked up the detailed proposals she had been working on, her manner becoming immediately more professional and focused. Frederick, I want to establish 3 major initiatives over the next 2 years, each designed to utilize my background while serving important public purposes. She handed him a document that Margaret could see was meticulously researched and professionally formatted. First, I want to create an annual International Women's Economic Summit, bringing together female entrepreneurs, policymakers, and researchers from across the Commonwealth to develop strategies for improving women's economic opportunities. This would position Britain as a leader in women's empowerment while creating concrete policy recommendations for member nations. Frederick reviewed the document carefully, his expression growing more thoughtful as he processed the scope and sophistication of Isabella's planning. This would require coordination with multiple government departments and international partners. Exactly, Isabella confirmed with satisfaction. It would require exactly the kind of international relations experience and policy development skills that I bring to this role. It would also demonstrate that royal influence can be used to address real challenges rather than just providing ceremonial support for other people's initiatives. She handed him a second document. Second, I want to establish a scholarship program for students from underserved communities who want to pursue careers in public service. This would include mentorship components, internship opportunities, and ongoing support networks designed to create pathways for diverse voices in government and nonprofit leadership. Sir David leaned forward with obvious interest. A program like that could address significant diversity challenges in public service recruitment. Isabella nodded enthusiastically. It could also demonstrate the monarchy's commitment to expanding opportunity rather than just preserving traditional privilege. The scholarship recipients would be selected based on merit and potential, regardless of social background or family connections. Margaret watched Frederick's expression continue to evolve as he grasped the strategic value of Isabella's proposals. These weren't vanity projects or emotional reactions. They were carefully conceived initiatives that could enhance the monarchy's relevance while serving important social purposes. The third proposal? Frederick asked, his tone suggesting genuine interest rather than diplomatic politeness. Isabella handed him the final document with visible pride. I want to create a network of partnerships between British institutions and international development organizations, focusing on areas where our universities, research centers, and nonprofit organizations could collaborate with similar institutions worldwide to address global challenges. She moved closer to Frederick, her enthusiasm becoming more apparent as she described her vision. Imagine the impact if we could facilitate partnerships between British medical researchers and African health organizations, or between our educational institutions and Asian literacy programs. The royal convening power could break down barriers and create collaborations that might never happen otherwise. Lord Pemberton finally found his voice, though it carried a note of bewilderment. Your Majesty, these proposals would require substantial resources and coordination efforts. The administrative complexity alone would be enormous. Isabella turned to him with an expression of patient determination. Lord Pemberton, I spent 12 years before my marriage managing complex international projects with multiple stakeholders, competing interests, and resource constraints. Administrative complexity doesn't intimidate me. Administrative incompetence does. The subtle insult hung in the air, but Lord Pemberton was too stunned by the comprehensiveness of Isabella's proposals to take immediate offense. Margaret could see him struggling to process the idea of a queen consort who wanted to manage substantial projects rather than simply lending her name to other people's work. Frederick set down the documents and looked at Isabella with an expression that combined surprise, admiration, and something that might have been affection. Isabella, these proposals are impressive. They're also ambitious enough to require significant changes in how the palace operates and how your role is structured. Yes, they are, Isabella agreed readily. They would require treating me as a professional partner rather than a decorative accessory. They would require acknowledging that I have valuable skills and allowing me to use them effectively. She paused, her expression growing more serious. Frederick, they would also require you to support me publicly when traditionalists complain about departures from established protocols. Are you prepared to do that? The question cut to the heart of the matter. Isabella wasn't just asking for permission to pursue her initiatives. She was asking Frederick to stand with her against the inevitable resistance from conservative elements within the palace, the government, and the public. Frederick was quiet for several long moments, clearly weighing the implications of such support. Finally, he spoke with a conviction that surprised everyone in the room. Isabella, you've presented a compelling case for changes that could significantly enhance the effectiveness of royal charitable work while making better use of your considerable capabilities. I think we should move forward with implementing these proposals. Margaret felt her heart skip as she realized that Frederick had just agreed to support the most comprehensive restructuring of queen consort duties in modern royal history. Sir David and Lord Pemberton looked equally stunned, clearly having expected Frederick to reject Isabella's demands rather than embrace them. Isabella's reaction was immediate and transformative. The rigid tension that had characterized her posture for days melted away, replaced by an energy and enthusiasm that Margaret hadn't seen in years. "Frederick, thank you," Isabella said, her voice carrying genuine warmth for the first time since the confrontation began. "I promise you won't regret supporting these changes. They'll make me more effective as queen consort and strengthen the monarchy's relevance for future generations." But Frederick wasn't finished. "Isabella, I also owe you an apology. I've spent 15 years treating your professional background as interesting but irrelevant rather than recognizing it as a valuable asset that could enhance our work together. That was short-sighted and, frankly, disrespectful of your capabilities." The apology was unexpected and clearly heartfelt, representing a level of personal accountability that royal marriages rarely witnessed publicly. Margaret could see Isabella's surprise and appreciation, but also her wariness about whether Frederick's support would survive the